Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure. My guest today is Joel Trammell. I will tell you about Joel in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is a show that deals with what's often called the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we feel toward others. And when you do it as a leader, as you will know that Joel is, you do it with a generous heart and an ability to bring people together for common cause. Joel Trammell, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on today, sir.
So great to be with you, John.
I want to tell folks all about you. Joel Trammell is the founder and CEO of Chorus Systems, which is a business management system that empowers CEOs like Joel to lead high-performance organizations. He's also the owner of Texas CEO Magazine, which reaches more than 10,000 CEOs across the state. Joel is a longtime entrepreneur and has been in the saddle at Chorus Systems for a very long time, which is remarkable because most CEOs don't have the lifespan in their job of an NFL running back, which is getting shorter and shorter. Joel is the author of the CEO Tightrope. We're going to talk about that. And so welcome, Joel. It's a pleasure to have you.
Great to be with you.
Great. You know, a term I use, and it's in my newest book, The World Turned Upside Down. So what are businesses like in Texas, or for what you perceive?
Well, Texas, certainly it's a little different than some of the country. We were a little quicker to reopen up, and things are going maybe a little more smoothly, but still we had massive dislocation, certainly in the services industries, restaurants, hotels, travel, across a wide range of industries that we're still feeling the effects of.
Sure. So what lessons do you think, as we're a year and a half into the pandemic, what lessons have businesses learned?
Well, this was certainly, I've had a 30-year business career, and this change, this event was certainly very different than some of the others that we went through, 9/11 and others that were shocks to the system, but very different. This more resembled to me a war that broke out in the middle of your country. And usually even with a war, you have some lead up and time and people understand things are getting worse. This one hit us very quickly. And so we learned that, there's a lot of risk in the system, that we had spent a lot of years doing things like just-in-time inventories and getting very efficient with the way we ran our businesses. And then suddenly our people couldn't show up to work. We couldn't get supplies, we had shortages, all kinds of issues. And so, there are risks that a lot of people weren't prepared for. And I think it will certainly change going forward. I think people will take precautions to think about some of these risks much more than they had in the recent past.
Well, it was an extraordinary year. I mean, when we had 9/11, and then 8 years later, we had the Great Recession. This year, we had the virus. We had economic fragility and dislocation. We had spotlight rightly shown on racial injustice. We had climate crises. And to top it all off, we had a very contentious election process. So our country is pretty stirred up, I think. So what lessons do you think business leaders have learned? What do they tell you, Joel?
Well, I think it is brought to the forefront that people management is critically important, right? How you handled this crisis from a people perspective, what you told people. I was cautioning CEOs very early on to be careful about what you say about the future, because you remember it was 2 weeks to stop the spread, right? And trying to promise that, if we just get through this short period of time, things will be better on the other side. Well, unfortunately, it's been a long time to get to better. And so you can't promise a lot of things. You got to be very careful about that.
Well, let me just throw you a question, because, you're in the saddle yourself and your constituents are CEOs. So, we all feel fear. And if you didn't feel fear, you would be an absolute fool. So when they say, hey, Joel, I'm feeling fearful about this, what counsel do you advise?
Yeah, absolutely. All of us felt fear, and it's fear of the unknown, right? We'd never seen this situation before. And fear is a very powerful motivator, as we found out, and it's a continuing. I think one of the things you have to realizes just because the pandemic, whatever definition you want to use for that, is easing, doesn't mean the fear has gone away. I was at the beginning, I was very much saying, once you scare people, you can't unscare them.
Yeah, hadn't quite heard that. Very well put, Joel. Yes.
That is a process, and so that is going to take time, and so you have to be aware of that you're dealing with a lot of people who are still, fear is still high in the emotional state, and you're going to have to do things to try to calm those fears.
So, and what about the, you hit the nail on the head. Well, the reason we're fear is because we have an ambiguity around us and we're all seeking clarity. Okay. So what clarity can business leaders provide? What do you counsel in that area, Joel? So,
yeah, the big thing is be careful about what you promise about the future.
Sure.
That you can't control. You can tell people that you have plans. You can tell people what those plans are. But as we learned through the pandemic, you can't predict the future. And you can't say necessarily things will be better in 6 months or a year out or whatever, or we'll be back to normal, whatever normal is. But communicating, maybe over communicating during these times is critically important. Telling people that you're adjusting, you're monitoring the situation, what actions you're taking, and that those are all subject to change because the situation can indeed change very rapidly, as we saw.
Great. Now I want to focus on your book, The CEO Tightrope. I love that title. I'm not sure. I think I know what tightrope means, but why did you come up? Where did that title originate?
Well, when I wrote the original manuscript and sent it to my editor, we didn't really have a title. And so
you wouldn't be the first author to do that. The title comes later.
Exactly. I tell people I'm not a very good title guy. And their comment was, you seem to be having a lot of left hand, but on the other hand arguments, on this hand, that, and
FDR would have loved you. So.
Yes. He wanted the one-handed Supreme Court justice lawyer, one-handed lawyer, right? But so she said, it seems like you're, kind of, it's a balancing act and you're walking a tightrope. And I said, yeah, that is exactly the concept that I am trying to get across, that I didn't realize I was trying to get across. But the CEO job is very much kind of down the middle. I think, the more the person in the job is centered, if you're extreme on either end, that's going to cause a problem in any personality characteristic when you're doing the CEO job.
Right, I like that. But it's also kind of, to me, Joel, either intended or not, to me, the tightrope metaphor works perfectly for our time. If you think we're tightrope for me, okay, I'm a fearful person. I'm not that adept, certainly at my age, at crossing a tightrope. So I think it's a marvelous metaphor. And so that's why I ask you. So.
Another piece of the metaphor that I think makes sense is a tightrope walker generally doesn't stay still, right? They have to keep moving forward to keep their balance. It's much harder. That's the really good tightrope walkers show you they can stop on the tightrope. That's a really hard skill, right? It's a lot easier to keep moving. And I think there's also that metaphor is relevant as well.
Great. Now let's dive into that. You have a concept called own the vision. What specifically do you mean by that, Joel?
Well, as a responsibility of the CEO, you're the keeper, if you will, of the vision. Some people would call it strategy, but to me, it's more than just the strategy. It starts with mission and vision. Why do we get up in the morning? How do we think we're going to change the world? How do we think we're going to make the world a better place as our organization? Then it gets into values. How are you different? How do you look at the world differently than other people? A lot of times with values, people want to choose things like honesty. And I say that's not very helpful as a value, because I can't imagine somebody taking the opposite, saying, I want our organization to be dishonest.
I can imagine people being dishonest, but not advertising it.
Exactly. And so values, to really be a value that helps people make decisions in your organization, you have to come up with things that people could imagine taking in opposite. You got to tell them what's the trade-off. There's always a trade-off. People want things for free. There's always a trade-off. And so then you come up with the values, and then you start talking about strategy and strategic objectives and what we're going to achieve out in the future, 2 years, 5 years, whatever. And all of that together, the CEO kind of owns nurturing that, keeping it together, keeping everyone on the same page, from the intern that's working in your office during the summer to the most experienced person in the company, to the customers, to the shareholders, all of the stakeholders in your related to your organization.
Great. Now, you have a phrase called finding the right resources. That's a common phrase, but you say, let's be creative about it. So what does it mean to be creative about finding the right resources, Joel? So
there are, two major resources most CEOs have to deal with. They have to deal with the human resource side and the capital resource side. Now, when I first got into business, people thought the capital resource was the hard thing to come by, and human resources were kind of easy to come by. And that's certainly flipped now. And I think most CEOs you talk to, their biggest problem by far is the human resource side.
Right.
And so then you've got to spend some time figuring out why and how you can attract the right people to want to come work for you. I was on the phone with the CEO this morning, and they said, I need to hire this great new sales executive. And I looked him in the eye and I said, yeah, but why is that guy going to want to come work for you? Because you're
good. I like that, Joel. That's exactly right. And I'm sure that's why you are successful, because you're not afraid to lay it on the line.
So I said, what would a person look like? What do you have to offer? What are your unique skills, and where can you go find somebody? So in my career, there have been various things that have been helpful for me in finding resources. One, I served in the U.S. military. And so I understand how the military works. I understand how to read an officer's fitness report, which is their performance evaluation that the military gives. If you've never read one before, you would think everybody's wonderful because it makes everyone sound wonderful. But there are specific clues you look for that tell you actually who were the superstars compared to others. And so I recruited a lot of people out of the military because I had an advantage. I could read and figure out who were the best. I went to a small engineering school in Louisiana called Louisiana Tech University. Microsoft and Google didn't fly their corporate jet to Ruston, Louisiana to recruit. Now, there weren't as many great engineering candidates as there are at Stanford or the University of Texas, probably, but their top few candidates were as good as anybody's. And I could drive my car to Ruston, Louisiana and offer jobs in working in Austin, Texas. And for a kid in North Louisiana, that sounded like a pretty good gig. And so you've got to find unique ways to uncover people that can be successful in your organization.
Great. And I think that leads into your personal approach to recruiting. You've been describing it. So is there something you want to add to that? Because I like the way that you kind of phrase this, is it looking under rocks, should we say, or off the beaten path, or unicorns? And I mean, the one of a kind type, or what's your perspective, Joel?
Yeah, you certainly, everybody's looking for the next Michael Jordan, if you will, superstar. But you also have to be realistic, right? Michael Jordan's not going to play, but for a few teams, right? And so if you're the Poughkeepsie Pioneers, you're not going to find Michael Jordan. You have to understand what you can find. But I do think CEOs often are not near as involved in the recruiting process as they should be. I think it's important that one person in the organization set the quality bar. And most managers, even if you are a growing company, only get to hire 1 or 2 or 3 people a year. Well, you don't get very good at something if you only do it a few times a year. I once did 252 interviews in a single year to hire 100 people. You do 252 interviews in a row in a year, you get pretty good at it. You start learning what talent is. You start learning what an $80,000 person in Austin, Texas gets you at that particular time. And I think that's important that organizations take the recruiting activity as a continuous process of trying to find great people instead of, oh, a job opened, we're going to try to hire somebody.
I once had and I actually wrote about it for an article I did for Harvard Business Review about the I versus we. And it was a hiring manager that came up to me after a talk, and he said, I have a little informal thing I do. And I wonder if you've heard this before, Joel. When he's interviewing a candidate, he marks down the number of times the candidate says I versus we. And he said the ones who quote scored the more we's, he was more interested in them. Now, in some ways, I think that's kind of an artificial thing, because if you're in a job interview, you have to talk about yourself. But it's an interesting concept. And when I do some coaching of young people and mentoring, and I pass that lesson. Always say we. But it is a frame. You kind of talk around it, and I was able to do this, and we work together, and that type of thing. Does that resonate at all with you, Joel?
Yeah, I think it depends actually on what you're looking for, right? I mean, certainly if I'm hiring executives, if I'm hiring managers, I'm looking for people who understand a teamwork framework and that they're not going to accomplish everything personally. Now, if I'm looking for the best software developer in the world, I may want to hear a lot of because I'm looking for somebody who's going to be very creative and do a lot of things personally to help the organization. So I think it could depend on the role.
Okay. Now I'm gonna. This is why I wanted to talk to you. And I've read a lot of management books and leadership, and written a whole bunch of them. And I have never seen the term quote oddball used as I think it's a positive. So tell me what you mean by hiring oddballs.
Well, and it starts with culture, and I often use in a National Football League analogy, because a lot of people are familiar with the NFL teams, and you see certain teams that have very strong cultures, and you see certain teams that have weak cultures, and a team like the New England Patriots, famous for their strong culture, you'll see a player that washes out with some team that supposedly had a lot of talent, but he was, a problem in the clubhouse, or he wasn't coachable, or those kind of things. Well, New England's made a habit of picking those players up, and suddenly they become all pro players in New England, and all they do is score touchdowns and win Super Bowls, right? And you never hear any problems before. And what it shows you is that if you have a strong culture, that you impact the employee. If you have a weak culture, the employee impacts your culture.
Excellent point. Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
And so therefore you can make use of these people that other people might consider oddballs, because if they have a weak culture, it would impact them. But if you have a strong culture, you can integrate a very diverse set of people.
I'm glad you mentioned the Pats. I followed them for years because my Tom Brady, their quarterback, played here. I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I watched Tom play as a collegiate player. But one thing about New England, and it scratched me into the surface, obviously to talk about Bill Belichick, of course, but it's self-discipline amongst the teams. And so you must, I'm sure you coach your people about this, and it's how important is self-management, or quote, the way we do things here. The Patriots call it the Patriot way. So
yeah, I mean that's everything, right? I mean that is the culture, and driving that down, and not having a very top-centric organization where the CEO is making every decision. What color's the wallpaper going to be? What type of print on the business card? Pushing the decision making down to the lowest level appropriate is a key attribute that gets buy-in then from the whole organization. And then that creates that we culture that you talked about earlier. If people feel like they have a significant input into the organization, they're trusted and responsible and allowed to make decisions, you get a lot more buy-in. And then everybody's enforcing the culture, instead of you as the leader having to constantly run around and beat people with the proverbial wet noodle or whatever to get people to obey. Everybody's engaged in the culture.
I'm glad you raised this point, and it gets back to your military background. I believe you're a naval veteran. Am I correct?
Correct.
So when you talk about pushing, and this is common sense management, of course, but it's not so common, push decision making to the front lines and stuff. And people might say well, Joel, you came out of the military. You know what a top-down system is, right? So explain that pushback. What is it? What's the virtue of the bottom-up process too? So
well, most people that push back on the military have never been in the military and have this view that, if you're a general leading a battle, you're commanding every troop exactly where to move at what time. And there's something that instead the military learned a long time ago that doesn't work very well, because as one general famously said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And so what commanders have learned to do is communicate what they call commander's intent. Okay, my intent is for you to take that hill. Here's the plan that I think will work, but your job's to take the hill. If you find a better method, you change the method. If the situation on the ground changes, you adjust to the situation. And so that's what the same thing is true in business. My job as the leader of the organization is to set the intent. Here's the goals and objectives that we're trying to get to. I may help you develop how I think you're going to get there, but if the situation changes, your job's to accomplish the objective, not to follow the plan. And that's what too many organizations don't understand. They create this plan and think that's some Bible, that 12 months later, they're still following that plan, even though the situation's dramatically changed.
Good point. I've thought, and I'm thinking, and I want your perspective on this, that crisis is a great time to evaluate talent. Do you have a thought on that, Joel?
Well, I think you should always be evaluating talent. I think, 100 years ago, when capital and equipment were the key operating parameters for a business, you think Henry Ford and his manufacturing line or something like that. They had a team that 24/7, 365 days a year took care of that manufacturing line, knew about all the equipment, could rebuild it, could take it together, do preventive maintenance, all of that. Where is that organization for you in your company when your asset, your biggest asset, probably where you're spending 80% or more of your expenses, are the people? And so that's what you need to build. Your management team needs to be that organization that is constantly engaged with making the productivity of that asset as good as possible.
Thank you. Now, when you talk about hiring, one of the things that I often talk to people that I work with, senior executives, is when possible, hire for the future rather than for an immediate need. Do you agree with that, Joel?
Yeah, I'm certainly. I'm a best available athlete drafter. If you want to use the NFL analogy again, I want the best person, most talented person I can get, and then my job as the leader is to craft the positions appropriately so that they can be most productive. And so, unfortunately, the best people aren't available necessarily exactly when you want them. I mean, I see CEOs all the time with this hiring plan. We're going to hire this guy in the second quarter, this guy in the third quarter. Well, what if that person's not available in the second quarter? But what if that person that you thought you need in the fourth quarter is available now? You absolutely should go ahead and hire them and make it happen. So, I think you hire not only with the eye that they need to be able to grow in your organization, but you need to hire the best people when they're available.
I want to I'm going back to where you were, and you talked about your time at Louisiana Tech, and it's not a Stanford, and it's not this program, but there's such good talent coming out of that. And so I want to dispel some of this elitism that exists. So what do you tell people? They might say, well, this candidate's from this school or that school, but it's not a Stanford. So what's your perspective when people push you on that?
Well, I'll tell you a story, a very personal story that kind of illuminated it for me. So I played tennis at Louisiana Tech, and the SEC is, we were not in the SEC. We were in a small conference, and the SEC, of course, looked on as the power conference. And my last college match, my junior year, we played the Alabama, and their number one doubles team was 17-0, had been undefeated, was ranked number one in the polls in the NCAAs, and we beat them in straight sets. And
good for you.
Exactly. Right. Now, I'm not going to claim I was a better doubles player than those two, others, because, if you took the whole record for the year, they deserve to be ranked number one. But on that day, on that court, I realized we were as good as anybody in the country. And that was kind of, I'd grown up in a small town, and, you always look around and you think, oh, well, I'm maybe good for this area, but everybody else is better. And I think what you find, certainly through my business career, there are smart people, talented people everywhere. And, no region, no school, no area has a lock on all the smart people.
Right.
And
Totally. But sometimes do you think talent, we know about the overselling, but do some talented people undersell themselves? Do you see that at all, Joel? So
absolutely. I mean, I think, we went through this craze in business for a while where we were letting people write their own reviews. We thought that was going to be smart. And what I saw most of the time were the C players thought they were superstars and the A players were telling you how bad they were. And so, yes, I think a lot of the most talented people often undersell their own abilities, and that I've seen that. My wife's a 4.0 PhD in electrical engineering, and was one of the world experts in network performance when we were running the business, probably the expert. But she would tell you, she would always downplay her experience, even though she was doing, world leading stuff. So, yeah, I think that's very common.
Great. Now you have something which I think is it's tangible and accessible. It's the CEO Scorecard. Tell us about that, Joel.
Well, I think one of the challenges that many CEOs face is they get no feedback from anybody that really understands what they should be doing. And so often, they're hearing their employees can't really be honest with them. Often boards don't know what to exactly say. And so what I was trying to do with that assessment and scorecard is give boards and CEOs a way to think about the role and a way to assess their performance, both personally assess their performance and then have others that are working around them see if their self-awareness was high enough that their view corresponded with what the people around them thought was objective reality. Because, most CEOs, it's a very lonely job. You have no one to go talk to. You have no one that really understands. You go talk to the spouse. They don't care.
Sure.
It's not the same
You're
thing.
still taking out the garbage or whatever.
Yes, exactly. And so, just trying to give people a way. I think everybody feels unqualified for the job when they first get it. And I tell people, if you make me CEO of your company tomorrow, I'm unqualified. I don't know your customers. I don't know your employees. I don't know your stakeholders. Nobody's really qualified the day they take over. But if you have some framework, you can think about how you get better at the job every day.
Great. I'm glad that you're imparting some structure, framework on that. It gives people something to follow, and that the scorecard concept is great. Something you said that I think is important about, and we hear it a lot, and I've had this conversation with previous guests about it's lonely at the top, okay? And it's even more lonely when we're all socially isolated. I know some folks who encourage CEOs to mix and mingle with one another. Is that something you have found of value, Joel? So,
absolutely. I mean, I think, CEO peer groups and other opportunities can provide tremendous value, especially if you can find people who are really peers. They're running, similar size organizations, similar type organizations. Don't have to be in the same industry, but just similar in terms of size and complexity and the problems you're dealing with. I absolutely think you ought to search out for those people that you can share some stories with.
Great. We're coming to the end, but I want to talk about your magazine. How does it fulfill a need in your market? What's the operating mission statement for that?
Well, those of us in Texas think we're in a whole nother country anyway. And
well, the rest of us sometimes think that about you, Joel, but
that's right. So
we're not going that way.
So we thought there was a need, for Texas CEOs. Texas certainly a business centric state, a state that wants businesses to come and build their business in Texas, business friendly state. And so we believe, it's to educate and communicate and connect CEOs in the state of Texas to make them and the state more productive.
Cool. We are coming to the end, and I ask every guest to share a story of grace. And do you have one you want to share, Joel?
Well, I think this pandemic has been a case where, life continued to happen during the pandemic, right? People continued to have challenges. I've had some relatives, develop serious medical conditions independent of COVID. I've had employees go through divorce and trying times. And, life continued to happen, even though a lot of our social outlets were taken away. A lot of people quit going to church, which if you had told me they were going to close the churches, I'd have said that can't happen. I don't understand how that's going to happen, but that happened. Obviously, going to dinner and even just socializing in the work environment went away. And so it has been a time that has stretched people. And I think, as leaders, I've certainly had to reach out and spend much more time personally with people than I normally would have to replace some of those interactions that would have happened naturally or causally, casually in the work environment. And, I think there's been a hole left for a lot of people. And I think we're going to, I don't think we realize how big a hole may be at this point. I think we're going to have to work really hard for the next year or two to kind of dig out of that hole from a social perspective.
Okay. Well, thank you, Joel. You have been a wonderful guest, and I appreciate it. How can people find you? So
if they want to learn more, joeltrammell.com. You can go on and take the CEO assessment if you want. You can look at the book, and we'll have another book coming out here, hopefully by the end of the summer, which in Texas is about September. So.
Oh, good. Joel, thanks for being on. With that, I'll close it out. So.